This is Monica Perez, and we are on, I don't even know, this is our 10th Maker of the Modern Mind out of 12. So we're actually whipping through this book. I thought it would literally take a year. It probably actually will literally take half a year, but I find it very engaging. And you know, my goal here, it's Saturday story time. And I feel like this is an hour. You can zone out, listen to me read you this little story while you make your pickles or fold your laundry. And also, it's super fun for those of us who are here live, which is Tuesdays at 2 o'clock Pacific, 5 o'clock Eastern. All very fun. I enjoy this. It keeps my mind off my troubles and it makes me not think about current events. We're going to talk about that this week on cognitive dissonance. But for now, let's go to Darwin, who I do not personally care for. I am not a fan. And but let's see how Thomas P. Neal, PhD, portrays Darwin. This is the title of this chapter is Struggle for Survival. The direct influence of the Benthamites was cut short by changes in the temper and the tempo of Western life, changes which they ignored. Life quickened in the 19th century as steam and electricity were applied to industry, and within a few years, the face of civilization was changed as it had not been changed before within centuries. Anyone with even a short memory could see how change was the only constant factor in life, how man was progressing year by year, growing wealthier, healthier, and more powerful as he conquered nature for the first time since he emerged from the cave. Benthamites did not take this newly intensified element of change into consideration. Their thought was posited of a static world where institutions and customs would remain as unchanged as man himself. Because there was no room in their theories for radical alterations in society or man's way of thinking, their thought was soon discarded as boys' clothes are thrown aside when the gangling 14-year-old suddenly sprouts up. So even though these guys we don't feel their influence directly today, I feel like a lot of them were stepping stones and either created a reaction or somebody built on their stuff. That's how I read this book. I think it's interesting. I like the way this guy lays it out. Just it's deep, but also super accessible. I like it. Okay. Rapid change is taken for granted today, with last year's model in hats or automobiles, bombs or airplanes considered antique. It was not so in the middle of the 19th century. Things were changing more rapidly year by year. It is true, but habits of thought changed almost as slowly as ever. Bach's restrained music of the 18th century, for example, had given way to Beethoven's somewhat looser compositions of the early 19th, and Beethoven in turn gave way to noisy Wagner in the middle of the century. Only a small group of thinkers in Europe, however, had formulated their thought in terms of change. Hegel was the chief of these, and his dialectic, whereby everything was conceived in terms of movement, was a philosophical explanation of an older idea man had long cherished, that he was progressing towards a better life, that each generation was further advanced than its predecessor. Hegel explained all history in terms of the divine idea unfolding itself through history in accordance with certain laws of movement Hegel had discovered. Such a philosophy suited the changing temper of the times, but it was abstruse even for philosophy, and only the small group known as the young Hegelians, mostly Germans, took to it at first. Englishmen who were told that Napoleon was the divine idea on horseback, as Hegel claimed, understandably shrugged their shoulders and turned to find another use for the steam engine. Not even Frenchmen could take to the dialectic. They too would wag their heads when told that Prussia was the most perfect self realization of God on earth in Hegel's day. So, although Hegel had the right tune for the time, he failed to hit the right key. It remained for Charles Darwin to strike the note that awakened immediate response in all minds later in the 19th century. Hold on. Darwin's importance is therefore out of all proportion to his ability, his profundity, or his originality. I think that's probably right. He is like the new organ, which by playing a certain note broke all the windows in the church and in the neighborhood by starting sympathetic vibrations in them. For Darwin was neither a great mind nor a powerful writer, nor does he even stand among the 10 or 20 greatest scientists of the world. He simply happened to say what the age wanted to hear, and he said it in terms that pleased the age's ear. Darwin spoke of struggle for existence, survival of the fittest, competition for world resources, rapid increase of population, and all those other things the 19th century believed in so firmly. He mirrored the age's mentality perfectly, saying what was already believed, but putting it all together in a single pattern under a master idea: survival of the fittest through natural selection. This is the secret of Darwin's popularity. This is why he became a maker of the modern mind when many greater thinkers failed. Yeah, I think that mirroring an ageist mentality, but of course, I always would layer on top of this that not only maybe mirroring the mentality of the age, but perhaps also, or almost always, forwarding an idea that the those with the power to favor an idea would benefit from. I think you can never overemphasize that. Hegel was a philosopher who claimed that the ultimate reality in history is the idea. The 19th century, however, was indifferent to philosophy that tried to of any kind, and it was positively hostile to a philosophy that tried to resolve dollars and wheat, factories and ships into an idea, whether it be labeled divine or not. Darwin, on the other hand, spoke in scientific language about things one could see and touch. And in that age, who dared to doubt science? Who dared argue with a man who told you, in effect, to go out into your garden or your barn to do as he had done and see if his results would not be yours? Darwin backed up what he had to say about the struggle for existence with an amazing array of facts, showing how vegetables, bugs, little animals, and big all fought for the limited supply of food. He went further and, in the same scientific language and with the same mass of evidence, sought to show how lowly animals varied from time to time, how these variations accumulated until varieties melted into species. And see, that's the problem. The subtitle of his book is The Origin of Species. And I'll give him marginal evolutionary stuff for sure. Like, I think his method can work for little variations in species, but not entire species. Anyway, I'm sure I'll get to that later. And how out of it all came new forms of life until finally he included man himself. Moreover, he argued, if man had come so far by means of struggle and survival of the fittest, how much higher on the ladder of progress could he not climb? There seemed no limit according to Darwin's theory, and this was just what these people of the 19th century wanted to hear. So Burning Beard is backing me up. Adaptation, not evolution of a new species. Yes, I agree with that. Oh my gosh. Have I not told you guys about the case of the midwife toad? Where is it? It's a book by Arthur. Here it is. It's a book by Arthur Kessler, Koestler, the guy who wrote The 13th Tribe about the Khazarians. So, this guy has got, I don't know what, some kind of limited hangout stuff. But this book, The Case of the Midwife Toad, about Paul Kammerer, another one of these guys who like shot himself in the back of the head with his right hand, even though he was left-handed, like something, and that was suicide, whatever. But he basically proved Lamarck was right and Darwin was wrong. We should read this one together. Anyway, this is about that kind of thing, Burning Beard. You would love this. It require. Oh my gosh, he did not know about this book. Oh, yummy, yum, yum. You're gonna love it. It's probably some kind of limited hangout. They probably wrote it because they knew epigenetics was on the horizon. He wrote this in the 70s. And epigenetics disproves Darwin's idea that this is the origin of species. What I think really is happening is there are mutations, but the mutations are stored and accumulated, and they are accessed. It's called developmental plasticity. They're accessed as needed, which means the fetus, through the activity of the experience of the mother, will turn on or off the genes as it develops, and it can't go back. Like, it's developmental plasticity, not elasticity. And as the thing goes back, as the thing develops, then it can pass on that gene being turned on. But this means there is some subcellular intelligence that gets information, and that is a mechanism that is not known. You can put God there, and Darwin's whole point was that God is not his point, but the way it was used, God is not necessary. But we're still at the point with epigenetics, like, where is that information coming from? And it's like chaos theory. It's like quantum mechanics. It's like quantum physics. Sounds like God to me, but anyway, whatever. Yeah, put it on your reading list. Okie dokie. So Darwin had apparently proved their fundamental assumptions correct, people's fundamental assumptions, and apparently had shown that their wildest dreams for the future were scientifically established great expectations. So he made people feel like the sky was the limit, that we are going upward. And I think prior to this, when we were talking about was it the Benthamites that said, like, kind of like the next guy's going to do better than the last guy? I don't know. Anyway, I think those days are over. Jacques Barzun, Barzun, therefore claims that Darwin may be said, with a slight exaggeration, to have found the right wrong idea for cementing together in the minds of his contemporaries the elements of doctrine which had repeatedly been proposed along separate lines of thought. This is why Darwin's contemporaries looked upon him as another Newton, England's second gift to the scientific world. Alfred Wallace, who discovered the key idea of the theory of natural selection independently of Darwin, called him the Newton of natural history. Darwin's bulldog, Thomas Huxley, drove this idea home by comparing the men personally, by putting the origin of species alongside the Principia in importance and in grandeur. Man, it would take me a lifetime to actually probably plow through the Principia, but there's no doubt in my mind I would find it better than Origin of Species, as my mother would say. The English people prided themselves on Darwin as they had on Newton. They rewarded him like Newton in his own lifetime. They made him a Fellow of the Royal Society and an honorary member of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. They bestowed the Copley Medal on him in 1864. They buried him in Westminster Abbey with England's most distinguished gentlemen looking on. Like Newton, Darwin was significant for one book, The Origin of Species, although he wrote many other things. In this one book, Darwin did for the biological sciences what Newton had done for physics in the Principia, though with less originality and far less brilliance, and less accuracy, no doubt. He arranged in a systematic pattern what hundreds of predecessors had discovered, and it all made new sense in the light of a master idea. Yes, so I'm not disputing his research or his facts or what he wrote down, but the idea that, and I'll tell you what my problem with it is. Might as well tell you now. To get like a completely different thing, an eyeball or whatever, a lot of alleles have to mutate. A lot of individual little gene thingies. So, or you have like an eye spot, an eye spot. I can understand how an eye spot that maybe is just one little thing that's photosensitive, just one little mutation could give you a little bit of an advantage in that. You'd be like heat seeking. But what has to happen is every time there's a mutation like that, the entire rest of the species has to be exhausted or whatever, get extinct. And then all the ones that remain have this new thing, which means that it has to dominate, and all the descendants and stuff have to come out of that. So that one thing has to be so major that it's the difference maker for survival. But if that thing is made of like several mutated genes, they would have to build on each other and have that same effect without having that difference making ability every mutation along the way. So unless it's just one mutation that makes the difference, that's how I think about it. That's why it's just mathematically impossible for that to happen. And they have that like monkey thing. It's like if a monkey sat down, how many monkeys would it take to actually type out Great Expectations? A lot. and Richard Dawkins, I don't forget what his name is. He says, well, you're not understanding. Each monkey types out a different piece of it. And I'm like, yeah, but how do they all get on the same page? How would they all the different monkeys? It has to be on the same page. And I just think the math is absolutely impossible for that to work. So his master idea fails, in my opinion. It's a survival of the fittest and the struggle for existence because of the process of natural selection. That's his master idea. This prompted Huxley to assert that from Aristotle's time to his own, there is nothing comparable to the origin of species as a connected survey of the phenomena of life permeated and vivified by a central idea. And again, I'm not objecting to the central idea of the adaptation, just that it's the origin of species. Finally, Darwin's key idea was seized upon, as Newton's had been, and applied to every field of thought. Darwin's name was used to justify war as a natural form of struggle for survival among nations. It was used to justify the Marxian idea of class struggle as the inevitable natural relationship between economic groups. It was used to justify the most ruthless kind of capitalistic competition as good for mankind, since the fittest producers survive for the benefit of all. It was used to justify the persecution of some races by others, the refusal of poor relief to the less aggressive members of society, the rule of the weak by the strong few. All these things were excused in Darwin's name because he had struck the note which appealed to all from his day till our own. This has been an age of struggle and of competition, which is the basic theme running through Darwin's thought. That never would have caught on if they hadn't abandoned morality, compassion, like the rules of morality in society. If that hadn't already been severed, I don't think this would have caught on. This is section 1. So that was just the preamble to the Darwin chapter. In 1819, when Charles Darwin was 10 years old, or even in 1830 when he was 21, Lloyd's of London would have given any betting Englishman long odds that Dr. Robert Darwin's second son would never amount to anything. For throughout his boyhood and his youth, Charles gave promise of being only an insignificant member of a fairly prominent English family. His grandfather, Dr. Erasmus Darwin, had made a name for himself as a physician, a naturalist, and an author. His father was Shrewsbury's leading doctor and an imposing man who was respected by his neighbors and was influential in his community. For a long time, young Charles remained in the shadow of his grandfather, who had been a genius in a mild way, of his domineering father, and finally of his brilliant brother, Erasmus. Charles never met his grandfather, but the latter's fame lingered on, and Charles tried to be a loyal Darwin by reading the doctor's Zoonomia. He should have found out about evolution as he should have found out about evolution as expressed in that work. Charles's father, on the other hand, was very much in evidence throughout his son's youth and into his early manhood. Dr. Robert was called the Tide by his children because when he rolled his giant frame into the living room, he drowned out the conversation and even the unvoiced opinions of everyone present. The doctor expected Erasmus to carry on the family profession and to distinguish himself as his namesake had done. But of Charles, not much was expected, for his father complained that he, quote, cared for nothing but shooting, dogs, and rat catching. Robert tried, nevertheless, to make a physician of his second son, and when that failed, to educate him for the ministry. Inconspicuous and unpromising a lad though he was, Charles did not find his home life at all unhappy. Born on the same day as Abraham Lincoln, Charles Darwin grew up in entirely different circumstances from the, I'm going to put some air quotes on, great American. Poor Thomas Neal. I don't think there were red pills back then. His family occupied one of the best, most spacious homes in the community. Whatever money could buy, food and books, clothing, and domestic help was provided in abundance. Here, the 6 Darwin children grew up in an intimate, closely knit family. Charles tells us in pre-Freudian fashion that the first 3 years of a person's life are the most important, for then he possesses, quote, a virgin brain adapted to receive impressions. But he cannot tell us much of his early impressions. He remembered even his mother only vaguely, though he was 8 years old when she died. His relatives and acquaintances considered Charles a rather sluggish boy. He had the imagination of an average child, however, if we can judge by the fictions he invented to attract attention to himself. Biographers note only one thing about him, which might seem unusual: his bug collecting habits. But even this is not so unusual as his biographers have made it. He lived in a bug collecting age, and he came from a bug collecting family. They all did it, so Charles did it too. This is the secret of understanding Charles Darwin. He grew up doing what others did, believing what others believed, conforming to the accepted pattern without criticism, almost without thinking. He was therefore a commonplace lad at home. At school, he was the same. He attended classes at the Shrewsbury Grammar School from his 10th year until his 18th. Headmaster Samuel Butler thought him a little fool and repeatedly told him so. The boy simply remained indifferent to the classical curriculum they followed. He was bad at spelling, weak in the languages, as he remained till the end of his life, poor at composition, terrible at versifying. But Charles was not a simpleton. Even as a boy, he showed that when his interest could be aroused, he was far from stupid. In this sense, should we understand his statement in later life that his best early education was participating in his brother's experiments in the tool shed. The simple fact is that both, I'm sorry, but tool shed has come to have such a tainted meaning, as it were. Okay, the simple fact is that both Charles's father and Butler lacked understanding. Because the boy did not do well in school, they thought him stupid. By the time Charles was 18, his father was sure that he would grow up to disgrace the family. So Charles was taken out of the local school and sent off to Edinburgh with his brother Erasmus. There he was to study medicine, his father had decided, and because Charles was essentially an acceptor, he entered upon his medical studies without protest. He tells us how he found the lectures intolerably dull and how he had no stomach for the dissecting room. Medical studies simply failed to interest Charles's intellect or appeal to his temperament. At Edinburgh, as at school in Shrewsbury, Charles completely wasted his time, if we can believe what he tells us in his Life and Letters. He made certain acquaintances, however, who apparently influenced his interest at this time. One of these was Robert Edmund Grant, a young zoologist who praised Lamarck's evolutionary views, right on, in conversations with Darwin in 1826. It was Grant who invited him to join the Plinian Society, where he heard the eccentric Audubon tell all about the American turkey buzzard. 2 years at Edinburgh convinced Darwin that he was not meant to be a doctor. As a matter of fact, at this time, he apparently did not want to be anything in particular. So his father again made a decision. Charles was to become a clergyman. Without protest, he therefore went to Cambridge in 1828 to begin his theological studies. The 3 years he spent there, he states, were wasted as far as the academical studies were concerned, as completely as at Edinburgh and at school. But he goes on to admit that they were the most joyful in my happy life, for I was then in excellent health and almost always in high spirits. This was just what his father feared, for Charles had fallen in with the sporting set at Cambridge to lead an aimless life of hunting and of gathering in fellows' rooms. Darwin's set was much given to bug hunting, and Darwin was soon seized with the popular undergraduate mania of collecting beetles. There was nothing scientific to this hobby. Shout out to Mr. A and his lovely lady who has sent me some absolutely fabulous watercolors of beetles. I did not know how beautiful beetles could be. There was nothing scientific to this hobby, however, for all the undergraduates cared about in their bug hunting competition were number and variety of specimens. At Cambridge, Darwin came under the influence of the personable young John Henslow, who, although he lectured in botany, tried to interest Charles in geology. He put Sir Charles Lyell's recently published Principles of Geology in his hands and introduced him to Adam Sedgwick, the professor of geology at Cambridge. Darwin liked both the man and the subject, for it aroused his curiosity about the unknown, one of the basic traits of Darwin's mind. About this time, he wrote to a friend, "It strikes me that all our knowledge about the structure of our earth is very much like what an old hen would know of a 100-acre field, in a corner of which she is scratching." Darwin was curious to know what the whole field was like, and he was willing to scratch to find out. But his father had decided he was to become a clergyman, so he worked without interest at his theological classes until the beginning of 1831, when he passed his examinations for the degree. At this point in his life, when Charles Darwin was 22, it seemed that he was destined to be a parson in some inconspicuous rural parish. It seemed, too, that he would be the typical 19th century English clergyman whose hobby took up more time and interest than his official duties as minister. It seemed, finally, that he would continue to putter around with rocks and bugs, go on walking trips to hunt new specimens, write occasionally to men like Henslow and Sedgwick, read their books as they appeared, and spend his vacations at scientific meetings. A letter from Henslow, however, changed the whole course of Darwin's life. In the summer of 1831, Henslow wrote to tell him that Captain Fitzroy, well, I was in Patagonia, and I think it's Fitzroy. So I'm going with Fitzroy, but it's spelled Fitzroy. Wanted a young naturalist to accompany him on an expedition into the southern seas. Henslow went on to say that he would recommend Charles for the position if he were willing to take the 2-year trip. Charles was told by his father to refuse the offer, so he did. But the next day, his uncle Jos talked Robert into changing his mind, and young Darwin scribbled off a second letter informing Henslow that he would apply for the position after all. Once or twice in the next few days, Charles decided to abandon his quest for the position. But at Henslow's insistence, he finally arrived in London for an interview with the formidable Captain Fitzroy. I believe Fitzroy is the name of a big mountain in Patagonia. And that's how they pronounce it. Okay. And it's named after this guy, if I'm not mistaken. Charles liked the captain at once, but Fitzroy, who was an amateur physiognomist, did not like Darwin's nose. Nor did he think his face revealed sufficient energy and determination for the job. Oh, is a physiognomist the thing where they have like the map your face and decide what your tempers are or whatever? All right. He tried to discourage the young naturalist, but in successive interviews, when Charles persisted in his desire to sail on the Beagle, Fitzroy decided to accept him for the position. So, in the last month of 1831, Charles Darwin prepared for a 2-year voyage that was to stretch out to 5 years and profoundly affect his remaining life. Sailing on the Beagle was the making of Charles Darwin. He sailed a bug collector and he returned a naturalist. For his 5 years of scientific work on the Beagle made him not only collect specimens, but also study them and classify them. 5 years on board ship, moreover, was just what Darwin needed to develop self-reliance and the ability to make his own decisions. It is not too much to say that the trip changed his father's son into a mature man. Section 2. More legends have collected in 60 years around Darwin than around any other maker of the modern mind. One of them pictures Darwin as the ideal man of science, the humble, patient student who followed the trail of factual evidence to its inescapable conclusion and then resolutely and fearlessly announced his findings to a hostile world. This picture is largely the creation of Thomas Huxley, who devoted the greater part of an energetic, vociferous lifetime to popularizing Darwin's ideas. The more one knew of him, Huxley claims, the more he seemed the incorporated ideal of a man of science. It is true that Darwin was an able scientist. Especially, it is true that he had real devotion for the work. Darwin states the bald truth when he says, "My chief enjoyment and sole employment throughout my life has been scientific work." Equally important with his love for science was Darwin's intellectual curiosity. He always felt the need to understand natural phenomena which others took for granted, to establish order over a whole field of facts by formulating a law to explain them all and establish their interrelations. To this curiosity was added the power to stay with a subject patiently and persistently until it seemed thoroughly explored. Darwin possessed one more quality, making for a scientific bent of mind. He was an acute observer who managed to see what others overlooked. This again was a quality he appreciated in himself, for he admits that he was, quote, superior to the common run of men in noticing things which easily escape attention. These are qualities necessary for a man of science, but by themselves they do not make for genius. To them must be added scientific imagination and speculative ability, always under tight control. Imagination and speculative ability Darwin possessed in too full a measure. He was conscious both of possessing this ability and of its vital importance in the making of a scientist. "I am a firm believer," he wrote later in life, "that without speculation there is no good and original observation. I can have no doubt that speculative men with a curb on make far the best observers." Darwin knew that the scientist cannot give free rein to his imagination as the poet can. And he realized that on this point, he was constantly tempted to violate the sacred canons of science. Because he confesses a number of isolated facts soon become uninteresting, the habit of comparison leads to generalization. Hence arises, as I have found to my cost, a constant tendency to fill up the wide gaps of knowledge by inaccurate and superficial hypotheses. Huh. Yes, I understand. This is what people say about like conspiracy theorists. Like your mind wants to make order of all this stuff. So it just makes connections where there aren't any. I would argue that on a case by case basis. So, and I have done. But Darwin is definitely stitching this thing together and just ignoring the mechanism. Like the mechanism that he's talking about is not powerful enough because he doesn't understand how genes are built one upon another. You don't just like wake up one day with the longest, super long beak. Like it has to keep, the first little longer beak is not necessarily gonna get there. And it doesn't make all the other ones obsolete. So yeah, it can go only so far. All right. But he overgeneralizes, which is not a great habit for anybody. All right. Darwin's tendency to generalize drove him to conclusions not warranted by his factual evidence. There is no doubt that when once he arrived at his conclusion, he amassed such facts as supported the conclusion and looked on everything not supporting it as an obstacle to be overcome. His theory of natural selection, as we shall see, was essentially completed by 1838. For the next 20 years, Darwin collected facts to prove it. This tendency led him to adopt, yeah, I have a note here from the first time I read this book. It's the opposite of Newton. Newton had no hypothesis. He observed things and just talked about them. And if you wanted to draw a conclusion, that's totally fine. But he wasn't there to prove or disprove a pre-stated hypothesis. He was just there to observe phenomena, and maybe a conclusion falls out, maybe it doesn't. But yeah, it's almost like the definition of bad science to set out to prove a hypothesis. I mean, obviously, you can do it with if you have integrity and discipline in the process, but this guy seems a little fast and loose with all that. Okay. Okay, his theory of natural selection, as we shall see, was essentially completed by 1838. For the next 20 years, Darwin collected facts to prove it. This tendency led him to adopt some wildly erroneous theories, such as his idea of pangenesis, which he considered second in importance to natural selection itself. It is more the idea of a poet than of a scientist that, quote, every unit or cell of the body throws off gemmules or undeveloped atoms, which are transmitted to the offspring of both sexes and are multiplied by self-division. And end quote. And this no one takes seriously today. Darwin was a great scientist, but his tendency toward hasty generalization denies him the appellation ideal man of science given to him by Huxley, as Darwin himself would have had the good sense to admit. Huxley was not content with making Darwin merely an ideal scientist. He went on to tell readers that one could not converse with Darwin without being reminded of Socrates. Such a statement could never have come from Darwin, for though he considered himself a competent scientist, he insisted strongly that he had not a metaphysical head. I have no great quickness of apprehension or wit, Darwin wrote of himself accurately. My power to follow a long and purely abstract train of thought is very limited, and therefore I could never have succeeded with metaphysics or mathematics. It is for this reason that Darwin honestly confesses that my theology is a simple muddle. The more I think, the more bewildered I become. Huxley and his associates then used as much fiction as truth in weaving the legend of Darwin's mental powers. He was not a profound thinker. In the realm of abstract thought, he simply lost himself in confusion. Facts compel me, he says without excessive modesty, to conclude that my brain was never formed for much thinking. His strength of mind lay not in reasoning power, but in those more pedestrian qualities of accurate observation, patient reflection, industry in collecting massive quantities of evidence, and ability to arrange it all systematically so as to arrive at general conclusions. His weakness lay principally in his quickness to generalize, which, combined with the inability to reason abstractly, sometimes led him to absurd conclusions and always left him absolutely helpless outside his chosen field of natural history. That part of the Darwinian legend, which has him a Galahad of the intellect, searching nobly for the truth and defending her against obscurantists, has recently come under fire, perhaps unfairly to Darwin. It is now commonly asserted that Darwin was downright dishonest in his treatment of predecessors and contemporaries who prepared the way for his famous theories, and certainly the way he dismisses those who had written on evolution before the publication of The Origin seems to justify the attack. There is no doubt, for example, that his grandfather had stated almost every theory found in The Origin before Charles was born. But the latter dismisses Erasmus with a curt complaint about the proportion of speculation being so large to the facts given. Oh my gosh, that's hilarious. So the guy thought of it, and he didn't have the facts to prove it. And I would say you can't prove it because it's not true. And then Darwin went out and compiled a bunch of facts and said, yeah, this proves that, which I would also say didn't. All right. In similar fashion, he referred disdainfully to Lamarck and to the others whose writing made Darwin's world ready to acclaim The Origin. Contentious Samuel Butler demanded to know why Darwin had not credited his predecessors. And when no satisfactory explanation was offered, The blunt old critic wrote his Evolution Old and New to take credit and honor from Darwin and to pass it back to such men as Buffon, Erasmus Darwin, and Lamarck, where Butler thought it belonged. One need not consider Darwin dishonest, however, to account for the slighting way he treated his scientific predecessors. It is only necessary to appreciate this unusual contradiction in the man. Although he was apparently isolated from his age, actually he soaked up its attitudes, its speculations, its very atmosphere without knowing it. Darwin was essentially sponge-like, as we have seen, which accounts not only for his success, but also for his not knowing the source of his ideas. It is a fact that he had read and reread his grandfather's Zoonomia only to lay it down, believing he had gotten nothing from it. He had either read or heard of Lamarck's views, and he had discussed the alteration of species with scientist friends. Evolution was in the air, and Darwin soaked it in. He probably never realized how sponge-like, how accepting he was, so he could have been honest with himself and believing that his ideas were original. So I was talking to, it was a long time ago, Pete Q, and I guess I thought of something, and he was like, no, you heard it here. I'm like, I don't think so. He's like, I know you listened to that guy's show or whatever. You definitely heard it there. He said and his proof was this. The New York Times crossword puzzle is easier at the end of the day than at the beginning of the day. So I don't know where I don't know what scientific survey came up with that, but I completely believe it and agree with it. It's in the freaking air, and there's a non-zero increase in your likelihood of having that idea. That's my opinion. Okay. As a man, Darwin was lovable, gentle, simple. He was very much the family man, a fond father, a loving husband, solicitous for the welfare of each member of his family. In this respect, as in all others, he conformed perfectly to the accepted Victorian pattern of his age. He was properly modest in demeanor, thoroughly industrious in pursuing his work. His diversions were those of a simple man, walking, puttering in the garden, entertaining friends, going on vacations with the family, reading a great deal of light fiction. Lewis Carroll and Mark Twain delighted him, and he seems to have enjoyed any sentimental novel where virtue triumphed over vice and all characters eased gracefully off the last page, made happy by the author. If he could have had his way, he proclaimed rather vehemently, he would have had a law passed requiring a happy ending for every novel. As his appetite for fiction suggests, Darwin was a timorous soul who lived in continual fear of some dreadful happening. And for some time, he feared that France and England would go to war, whereupon he thought Napoleon III would cross the Channel and march toward London by way of the Darwin home at Down. The discovery of gold in California again threw him into panic because he thought that inflation resulting from an increase of the world's gold supply would make his fixed income worthless. These and other fears preyed upon Darwin while he was studying barnacles or conducting experiments with his pigeons. Physically, Darwin was an imposing man. He was tall, broad, well-built, and in his youth, he exhibited a liking for and an ability at athletics. But after his return from the Beagle trip, he developed a mysterious stomach disorder from which he suffered for the rest of his life. So that he complained he never knew one day of the health of ordinary men. He probably picked up some weird parasite, right? The cause of his trouble remains undiagnosed, but the fact that it hampered his activity in one way while helping it in another must be remembered to understand Darwin's persistent, though procrastinating, accomplishments. There were long stretches of time when he could not work at all. Usually, however, he was able to work 3 or 4 hours a day. The rest of the time, he lay around, rested or studied, or had his wife. He had a wife. That's like not the norm in this book, it feels like. His wife, Emma, read to him. Darwin could never have earned a living, but his illness did not prevent him from turning out an amazing quantity of writing. Fortunately, Darwin never had to work for a living. The directory at Down classified him as a farmer by profession, but the only farming he did was either experimenting with plants or raising flowers and vegetables as a hobby. He lived from an income settled on him by his father, so his time was free entirely for his studies and his writing. He did not teach nor did he lecture, as so many of his contemporaries did. He lived his life within his home, going away only occasionally for a change of scenery or in his earlier years to attend various scientific meetings. His life at home followed a clock-like routine. Every day he rose early, took a walk, ate breakfast alone, and worked from about 8 till 9:30. Then he took an hour's rest, sometimes following this with another hour's work before he went for a second walk. After lunch, he read the papers, had Emma read to him, took a nap, then walked again before supper. Sometimes, if he felt particularly well, he worked another hour before supper. After the evening meal, he played backgammon with Emma, had her read a novel to him, or listened to her play the piano. Promptly at 10:30, he went to bed. This routine was modified slightly in Darwin's later years as his health improved to accommodate his many famous guests. Darwin's list of friends and acquaintances includes most of the famous names of 19th century English history. As a student, he had listened to Audubon and Sir Walter Scott. As a young man, he had been helped by persons like Sedgwick and Lyell. As a famous naturalist, he was host to such men as Gladstone, Morley, Lord Playfair, Carlyle, and Butler. At various times, he associated with such persons as Ruskin and Mark Twain. His disciples included such prominent people as Spencer and Huxley, Weismann and Haeckel, Asa Gray, and Tyndale. Darwin's unvarying routine, combined with his devotion to science alone, tended to dehumanize him, as he realized later in life. He had studied the classics and theology in preparation for taking orders in the Anglican Church, but he put off settling down to pastoral work, first for 5 years on the Beagle, then for a few months to classify his specimens and write up his journal, a period which stretched into years. As other more immediate tasks presented themselves, Darwin never got around to becoming a clergyman. It is difficult to say just when and where he gave up the idea. Perhaps Darwin himself never knew. As it was with his vocation, so it was with his faith. Disbelief in the Old Testament, then in the miracles of the New Testament, then in Christianity itself, crept over him so gradually that he accepted his eventual agnosticism without pain or protest, not knowing precisely when he had arrived at that position. So it was with his aesthetic tastes, as he gradually lost appetite for poetry, music, and painting. His mind had become nothing, he admitted, but a kind of machine for grinding general laws out of large collections of facts. He therefore concluded if I had to live my life again, I would have made a rule to read some poetry and listen to some music at least once every week, for perhaps the parts of my brain now atrophied would thus have been kept active through use. I don't think he's wrong, and I wouldn't classify like the shit that's all beat as music. I would say like what he would have thought of as music, like the complex stuff, classical stuff, that kind of thing. Or you could do what my mother did. Play the horses. That'll keep you sharp. But I do think different pieces of your brain have to have different use. I really think that. And I think of it as like you don't have to rest or go on vacation or goof off. I call it crop rotation. So sometimes work in your garden, sometimes clean your house, sometimes read a book, sometimes read someone else's book, sometimes write, in, also out. Sometimes do math. I really think that that's the way. But I'm just guessing. I would have been great at being like a 19th century bloviator. Is that what that would be? Because I'm just guessing. But anyway, I think his guess is as good as mine. The loss of these tastes is a loss of happiness and may possibly be injurious to the intellect and more probably to the moral character by enfeebling parts of our nature. That was a quote. This passage is typical of Darwin. Its sentiment and its self-judgment are sound. Its basic assumptions, on the other hand, is a gratuitous materialistic belief that certain brain tissues atrophy from not recording music occasionally, that human shortcomings are basically mechanical defects in the organism. I don't know. There's definitely like synapses firing. And I think you need to blow the cobwebs out. Like when you get a new car, you got to, take it out, take it on the racetrack for a minute. Darwin is popularly, though. Oh, yeah. And there's that thing about autophagy, like a 3-day water only fast, cleaning out your blood. Why not? Similar mechanisms for the mind. Darwin is, oh, this is section 3. Do we have time for section 3? I think so. Darwin is popularly, though mistakenly, thought of as inventor or discoverer of evolution. He neither discovered it nor proved it. As a matter of fact, he did not even use the word evolution in the first edition of The Origin. He did two things for evolution. First, he sought to amass evidence to support the general evolutionary theory, which had been propounded in various ways by any number of men before him. Second, and most important, he offered a formula to show how evolution could have proceeded by centering his observations around the central fact of natural selection. Evolution sneaks into the origin by the back door. For Darwin's concern was only to account for the origin of individual species by means of natural selection. That is why he originally planned to call the book Natural Selection, and only reluctantly did he allow the publisher to change the title. By the time Darwin knew he wanted to write his great work, evolution was in the air, as much as gravity was in the air when Newton wrote the Principia. Barzun sums this point up well. The spirit of evolution hovered over the cradle of the new century. So far, it was not tied to any underlying philosophy. It followed its subject matter: mechanical action in astronomy and geology, unconscious will and purpose, or use and disuse in biology, climate and the conscious aims of men, and the social progress revealed by history. Hegel had promoted an evolutionary mentality in philosophy and logic. Comte had furthered it with his historical and pseudoscientific theories of progress. There were any number of works in the more specific field of organic evolution before Darwin started on The Origin. Bacon, Descartes, Leibniz, Kant, Lessing, Herder, Schelling had all looked at evolution as a possibility. Buffon, however, is the first great naturalist who can be classed among modern evolutionists. He seems to have glimpsed the importance of the struggle for existence in getting rid of the less fit, but his stress was on environment as the agent producing change in animal species. Strictly speaking, Lamarck and Erasmus Darwin were the first evolutionists to work out a scheme whereby all species evolved from a single origin through variation, the inheritance of acquired characteristics, and survival of some varieties in the struggle for existence. Both Lamarck and the elder Darwin had stressed the role of environment in changing habit and of altered habits in changing the creature. Lamarck, therefore, attributed an important place to the use or disuse of particular organs to account for their developing or disappearing from the species' bodily organization. Closer to Darwin in point of time were Englishmen who stressed the element of natural selection rather than use and disuse in causing variation in creatures. W.E. Wells had spoken of natural selection in a paper read to the Royal Society in 1813, and in 1831, Patrick Matthew had written of it. So the elements were all there. It remained for Darwin to play the role of Newton for the biological sciences, to put all the elements together, arrange them around a master idea, and thus bring light into the comparative darkness where men were groping toward what he was to say so clearly. The evolution of the idea of evolution in Darwin's own mind is an interesting story. He had sailed on the Beagle, a convinced creationist. Nor did he change his mind about evolution while aboard ship, though he later wrote that vague doubts occasionally flitted across my mind as he read Lyell's Principles of Geology or turned over new specimens. These vague doubts became stronger in the next few years as he studied his specimens and the notebooks which he had written aboard the Beagle and was now preparing for publication. As he arranged his collection of bones, he observed how extinct species were similar to existing ones, while the writing of his journal clarified his thought on the problems to be faced by either the evolutionist or the creationist. But his best biographer, Geoffrey West, shows that he approached no closer than this to the subject of evolution. Clearly, West observes, he was at this point picking at the problem rather than facing it. He finished his journal in the summer of 1837, however, and immediately started his first notebook on the transmutation of species. By the following February, his notebook was full of pertinent observations, and Darwin had convinced himself that species evolved from a few parent forms of organic life. How to account for the changes that took place, therefore, became his task. By this time, he had discovered his point of attack: variation among domestic creatures through controlled breeding was apparent enough. His immediate problem was to find an equivalent in nature for this human selection and preservation of the better varieties. Darwin was convinced that he was on the threshold of a discovery comparable to Newton's. He conceived it as his life's work, his great contribution to the fund of human knowledge. But first, he had some other things to get out of the way, chiefly his geological discoveries made while on the Beagle. Toward the end of 1838, however, he stumbled by pure chance upon the key to the whole problem of how species change. He was reading Malthus for diversion one day when he suddenly realized that here, in the Essay on Population, was the agent of natural selection he had been seeking. The necessary result of unrestrained multiplication among any species would obviously be competition for the means of existence. What Malthus had said of man was obviously true of plants and animals as well. The success of one competitor among animals and plants, as well as among men, meant the failure of others, and therefore their extinction. So by using Malthus, he could show how species became extinct, but not how they originated. Darwin concluded, however, that the latter was only the reverse of the former when variation is taken into account. Under these circumstances of struggle for existence, he tells us, favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones to be destroyed. The result of this would be the formation of new species. So by the end of 1838, Darwin had arrived at all his fundamental theories. 20 years were to elapse, however, before they were published. 20 years which Darwin seemed to dawdle away, procrastinating for years over geological studies, then for years more over his work on barnacles. In these years, nevertheless, and from these apparent unrelated studies, he gathered evidence to support his thesis of natural selection. In 1842, he completed his first draft of Ideas for the Origin, a paper running slightly over 30 manuscript pages. In it were all the ideas to be found 17 years later in the published work, and they were arranged on the same general plan. His first point was that variation occurs within species under domestication. Then he showed how similar variation occurs among wild species because of geological changes. Next, he invokes Malthus to show a struggle for existence among creatures, bringing about a natural selection more vigorous than man's in breeding animals. He therefore concluded, admit selection under subsistence pressure and change of environment, and could we set a limit to variations? All right, that's just a weird sentence from him, little weird quote from him. A second draft written in 1844 was extended to 189 pages, although it contained no new ideas. Darwin thought this draft important enough to make special arrangements for its publication in case he should die before finishing the great work. 2 years later, he proposed getting to work seriously on the subject, which he hoped to have ready for publication within 5 years. But for 10 more years, other matters, such as writing on volcanoes, occupied him. In 1855, Alfred Wallace wrote an article on the law which has regulated the introduction of new species, which was so similar to Darwin's own views that Lyell urged the latter to publish at least a sketch of his theory to protect his claim to priority. Darwin agreed to do so in a very thin little volume. That was his words. He began writing this little volume in the summer of 1856, but he was so fully convinced that this was the book of his lifetime that he found himself marshaling more and more evidence to support his views. So again, publication was put off. This sort of thing would probably have gone on interminably had Wallace not sent him the manuscript of an article on the tendencies of varieties to depart indefinitely from the original type. With the manuscript, Wallace sent a note explaining that he thought his idea was new and that he hoped it would provide Darwin with the missing link in the work he was projecting. Darwin, terribly agitated, wrote to Lyell, "I never saw a more striking coincidence. If Wallace had my MSS sketch written out in 1842, he could not have made a better short abstract." By mutual agreement, Wallace's essay and Darwin's sketch of 1844 were read at a meeting of the Linnean Society by its secretary on July 1st, 1858, and in this way, the theory of natural selection was announced to the world. By October of 1858, Darwin's manuscript had grown into a small volume, and by the end of the year, it had become a 500-page book, which was to be entitled. It's titled. Entitled means you deserve something. Titled, an abstract of an essay on the origin of species and varieties through natural selection. On Lyell's recommendation, John Murray had agreed to publish Darwin's work sight unseen. But when the manuscript arrived, its size and its argument aroused serious misgivings on Murray's part. The publisher was sure the work was too long and uninteresting. He was convinced, moreover, that its central thesis was absurd. So he suggested that Darwin rewrite the manuscript, confining himself to his observations on pigeons, for everybody is interested in pigeons. Darwin refused, of course, and Murray proceeded with the original manuscript. On November 24th, 1859, the long-delayed Origin of Species appeared. The entire edition of 1,250 copies was sold at Murray's annual book sale, and Darwin was standing on the threshold of fame. And I will leave you with that. We will start the second half of the Darwin chapter of Makers of the Modern Mind next week. Thank you so much for joining me. See you later.